The trip wasn't even supposed to happen. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been staring at my laptop after another 12-hour workday, wondering when my life had quietly become nothing but deadlines, grocery deliveries, and falling asleep with Netflix asking if I was still watching. I was 27, technically successful, financially comfortable, and completely burned out. So I did something impulsive. I booked 5 days off, grabbed my old camping gear from the storage unit, and searched for the most isolated campground I could find within driving distance. I wanted silence. No notifications. No meetings. No people asking me for favors. Just trees, a lake, and enough distance from civilization to remember what my own thoughts sounded like. The reservation website only had one lakeside campsite left. Perfect. I paid without thinking twice. 2 days later, I packed my SUV with enough supplies to survive a week if civilization suddenly collapsed. Tent, sleeping bag, folding chair, portable stove, books I'd been pretending I'd eventually read, way too much coffee, and enough snacks to feed a small family. By the time I reached the mountains, my phone had already lost signal. I smiled. Finally. The campground office was nothing more than a wooden cabin with a faded sign hanging over the porch. An older woman looked up from behind the desk as I walked in. "You must be Ryan." "That's me." She handed me a folded map. "Campsite 17. "I know. Lakeside." She frowned. Something about that single sound made me uneasy. She typed something into the computer again, then frowned even harder. "Oh, nobody wants to hear an employee say, 'Oh, is everything okay?'" She looked up with an apologetic smile. "It appears we have a small reservation issue." My stomach dropped. "What kind of issue?" She sighed. "The booking system duplicated one reservation." "Meaning?" She gave me an embarrassed look. "It thinks 2 different people own Campsite 17. I blinked. "How is that possible?" "Software update last week." "Of course. It doesn't happen often," she added. "I'd feel better if it never happened." She laughed. "So would we." Before either of us could figure out a solution, the front door opened behind me. Heavy hiking boots crossed the wooden floor. "You guys open?" I turned. The guy walking inside looked like he belonged in an outdoor equipment advertisement. Tall, broad shoulders, dark brown hair sticking out from beneath a baseball cap. Light stubble, a hiking backpack slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He couldn't have been much older than me. 28, maybe 29. The woman behind the desk looked between us. "Dean." "Yeah." She smiled, the nervous smile of someone about to ruin 2 people's day. "I believe we've found your problem." He looked confused. "My problem?" She pointed at me. "You both reserved Campsite 17. Dean looked at me, then back at her, then back at me. "You're kidding." "I wish I was." He laughed once. Not because it was funny, because sometimes that's all you can do. "So?" I folded my arms. "What now?" The woman clicked through several screens. Every few seconds her expression became more apologetic. "The campground is completely full." Dean sighed. "Seriously?" "I'm afraid so." "What about overflow camping?" "Closed for maintenance." He looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us had done anything wrong, which somehow made it even more annoying. She finally cleared her throat. "There is one possible solution." I already hated it. "What solution?" She smiled carefully. "The campsite is one of our largest." Silence. Dean slowly realized where she was going before I did. "No." She nodded. "Yes." I looked between them. "Wait." She clasped her hands together. "If you're both willing, you could simply share the campsite." Another long silence. Dean stared at the ceiling. I stared at the floor. She kept smiling hopefully. "No." Dean answered first. "I came here specifically to be alone." I nodded immediately. "Same." "I completely understand," she said. "But unless one of you wants to drive 2 hours back to town and hope another campground has availability." Neither of us answered, because she was right. Dean rubbed the back of his neck. "How big is the campsite?" "Nearly twice the normal size." She unfolded another map. One fire pit. Great. Two flat tent areas. Better. Private access to the lake. Dean sighed again. Of course, it's the best campsite. She smiled. It really is. I looked at him. He looked back. There was an awkward pause where both of us were silently calculating whether sharing a campsite with a complete stranger was better than wasting the entire trip. Finally, Dean shrugged. I won't bother you. I raised an eyebrow. You promise? I came here to avoid people too. That was surprisingly reassuring. The woman quickly added, You'll barely notice each other. Dean looked at me. I'm Dean. He held out his hand. I hesitated only a second before shaking it. Ryan. Temporary roommates? I laughed despite myself. Temporary neighbors. I can live with that. The woman looked visibly relieved. I'll waive both parking fees. Dean smiled. Now you're negotiating. And I'll give you free firewood. I looked at Dean. He looked back. Fine. He nodded. Fine. She nearly celebrated. Wonderful. I wasn't convinced it was wonderful, but it was happening. 20 minutes later, we drove separately toward Campsite 17. The gravel road narrowed until trees completely surrounded us. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I understood why everyone wanted it. The lake stretched out like glass. Pine trees surrounded the entire site. You couldn't see another camper anywhere. It felt completely private. Dean parked about 30 yards away, far enough to respect each other's space. Close enough that pretending we weren't sharing the same campsite would be impossible. We both got out of our vehicles. Neither of us spoke. There was an unspoken agreement that we'd establish invisible borders as quickly as possible. Dean looked around. I'll take that side. He pointed toward the western edge. Works for me. I'll use the fire pit after dinner. I'll use it after breakfast. Sounds fair. This is weird. It really is. For the next hour, we worked separately. Two strangers setting up two completely different camps only a short walk apart. I noticed things without meaning to. Dean's tent went up ridiculously fast. Military? Former scout? Professional camper? Whatever it was, he'd clearly done this 100 times. Meanwhile, I spent 15 minutes fighting one stubborn tent pole. I heard him laugh once. Quietly. He pretended I hadn't noticed. I pretended I hadn't either. Eventually, both camps were finished. The silence returned. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. As evening settled over the lake, I sat in my folding chair with a book I wasn't actually reading. Across the campsite, Dean was making coffee despite it being almost sunset. Who drinks coffee this late? Apparently he did. For several minutes we ignored each other. Then, you fish. I looked up. Dean held up a fishing rod. I shook my head. No. He nodded. Good. Good. Means there's more fish for me. I laughed. Fair point. That was the first real conversation we had. It lasted exactly 8 seconds. Then we both went back to pretending the other person wasn't there. It should have stayed that way. It would have, if the weather hadn't decided otherwise. The storm arrived without warning. 1 minute the lake reflected a perfect orange sunset. The next, the wind slammed through the trees hard enough to make both of our tents ripple. I looked up just as thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Seriously. Across the campsite, Dean looked toward the dark clouds gathering over the water. That doesn't look great. An understatement. Within 30 seconds, the temperature dropped. The air changed. Every camper knows that feeling, the strange stillness right before everything goes wrong. I stood. So much for a peaceful evening. Dean was already walking toward his SUV. We've got maybe 5 minutes. Rain hit before he finished the sentence. Not light rain. Not even normal rain. A wall of water. I barely had time to grab the camping chair before everything around me disappeared behind sheets of rain. Ryan. I looked toward Dean. He pointed at my tent. The rainfly. I turned. My heart sank. One side of the rainfly had come loose and was whipping violently in the wind. Oh, come on. I sprinted through the rain. The ground was already turning into mud beneath my boots. By the time I reached the tent, I was completely soaked. I grabbed one corner of the rainfly. The wind immediately ripped it out of my hands. You've got to be kidding me. Another gust bent one of the tent poles almost sideways. Great. Just great. Suddenly someone grabbed the opposite corner. Dean. Pull. We both leaned backward. The rain hammered against us so hard it almost hurt. I've got this side. I noticed. Stake. What? The stake came out. Of course it had. I dropped to one knee in the mud, trying to force it back into the ground while the wind fought every movement. Dean held the entire rainfly by himself. Almost there. I'm trying. Lightning flashed over the lake. Thunder followed almost instantly. Maybe we picked the wrong week to go camping. Dean laughed despite the situation. A little late for that. Finally, the stake held. The rainfly settled. The tent stopped trying to fly away. We both stepped back, completely drenched. Neither of us said anything for a second. Then Dean looked at me. You okay? I pushed wet hair out of my face. I've been better. He nodded toward my tent. Go check inside. I unzipped the entrance. The sleeping bag was dry. Most of my gear had survived. Not bad. See? He grinned. Crisis avoided. Almost on cue, a loud crack echoed somewhere nearby. We both turned. A thick tree branch crashed onto the empty space between our camps. Never mind, Dean muttered. The storm wasn't finished. For another hour, rain poured relentlessly. There was no point trying to cook dinner. No point sitting outside. No point pretending camping was relaxing anymore. I ended up sitting inside my tent listening to the rain hammer against the fabric. Then my stomach growled. Right. Dinner. I checked the time. Almost 8. The rain showed no sign of stopping. A few minutes later, someone knocked lightly against the outside of my tent. Ryan. Dean. I unzipped the entrance. He stood there wearing a waterproof jacket, holding 2 steaming mugs. I made coffee. I stared at him. You made coffee during a thunderstorm? I have priorities. I couldn't help laughing. He handed me one mug. Thanks. He shrugged. I figured we both lost dinner. Pretty much. Another burst of rain splashed across the campsite. Dean glanced toward his SUV. I also have instant noodles. I looked at my unopened cooler. I have sandwiches. Trade. Deal. 10 minutes later, we were sitting beneath the small shelter attached to the campground information board, the only covered place within walking distance. Rain surrounded us from every direction. Dean slurped noodles. I ate a sandwich. Neither of us spoke much. Oddly, the silence felt less awkward now. Maybe because we'd already survived a minor disaster together. So, Dean looked toward the lake. What made you book this place? I thought about lying. Instead, I shrugged. Needed to disappear for a few days. Work. Mostly. What do you do? Software engineer. He nodded. That explains the coffee addiction. What about you? He smiled slightly. Wildlife photographer. That surprised me. I was expecting. What? I don't know. Construction. I laughed. Honestly, everybody guesses construction. I wasn't going to say it. You were thinking it. Maybe. He smiled. I spend most of the year traveling. Sounds amazing. It sounds better than it is. That wasn't the answer I'd expected. You don't like it? I love it. He stirred the noodles absent-mindedly. I just spend too much time alone. Something about the way he said it made me look at him differently. Until then, he'd seemed incredibly comfortable by himself. Now, not so much. You? He asked. You live alone? Yeah. Like it? I hesitated. I used to. And now? Now I can't tell if I'm enjoying the peace or hiding from people. Dean nodded slowly. I know that feeling. The conversation faded again. Rain continued falling. Darkness settled over the lake. It occurred to me that, under different circumstances, we'd probably never have spoken. 2 random people. 2 separate lives. 1 reservation mistake. Funny how something annoying could accidentally become interesting. Dean finished his noodles. You know. What? When I heard someone else had booked my campsite, you were annoyed. I was. So was I. He laughed. I figured I'd end up sharing it with someone who talked nonstop. You got lucky. So did you. We smiled. For the first time all evening. Felt natural. Not forced. Not polite. Just easy. Then another crack of thunder shook the mountains. Dean looked toward the sky. Think your tent survives the night? I hope so. If it doesn't. He nodded toward his larger tent. I've got plenty of room. I looked at him. He immediately raised both hands. Not in a weird way. I laughed. I know. I'm just saying. I appreciate it. Hopefully you won't need it. So do I. Neither of us knew that, less than 2 hours later, I absolutely would. I woke up to the sound of fabric tearing. For half a second I had no idea where I was. Then another loud snap echoed above me. No. Rain was still pounding the tent. Wind shoved against the walls hard enough to make the entire thing lean sideways. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight. The beam landed on the ceiling. One of the support poles had bent almost completely in half. You've got to be kidding me. As if waiting for me to notice, the pole finally gave up. Crack. The roof collapsed inward. Cold rain immediately poured through the opening. Oh, come on. I scrambled to pull my sleeping bag away before everything got soaked. But it was hopeless. Water was everywhere. The tent wasn't flying away anymore. It was simply folding in on itself. Another gust nearly ripped the entrance open. I knew when I was beaten. I grabbed the backpack I'd packed with valuables, shoved my laptop inside, threw on my rain jacket, and pushed through the flap into the storm. The rain hit like ice. Visibility couldn't have been more than 20 feet. Dean's side of the campsite was barely visible through the darkness. I hesitated. He'd offered, but it was 2 in the morning. I hated asking anyone for help, especially someone I'd met less than 12 hours earlier. Another section of my tent collapsed behind me. Decision made. I jogged across the campsite, boots sinking into the mud. By the time I reached his tent, I was soaked for the second time that day. I tapped the side. Dean. Nothing. I knocked a little louder. Dean. A zipper moved almost immediately. The entrance opened. His flashlight shined directly into my face, then lowered. Ryan. My tent lost the fight. He looked past me. Even through the rain he could see the collapsed shape where my tent used to be. Damn. I know. He didn't hesitate. Get inside. I ducked into the tent. Warmth hit almost instantly. Compared to outside, it felt luxurious. Dean zipped the entrance shut before turning toward me. You okay? I'm fine. You look frozen. I probably am. He reached into a storage bag. Towel. I accepted it gratefully. Thanks. You weren't kidding. No. He looked toward the rain. I thought yours might survive. So did I. He shook his head. This storm's ridiculous. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. I dried my hair as best I could while Dean checked the weather forecast on a small emergency radio. No signal? I asked. Nope. Great. We're officially disconnected from civilization. He didn't seem bothered by that. Honestly, neither was I. Not anymore. Dean finally looked around his tent. It really was huge. There were 2 sleeping pads. Plenty of floor space. Enough room that sharing it didn't feel cramped. He scratched the back of his neck. So, I meant what I said earlier. I know. You can stay here. I smiled. I appreciate it. No problem. He pointed toward the empty side of the tent. Make yourself at home. This wasn't exactly how I imagined the trip. He laughed. Me neither. I laid my backpack beside the extra sleeping pad. Guess the campground owes us more than free firewood. Definitely. Outside, thunder rolled again. Dean opened another storage container. I've got spare blankets. You came prepared. I spend a lot of time outdoors. I can tell. He tossed me one. Then another. You always carry extras? I've learned weather doesn't care about your plans. Fair enough. I wrapped myself in one blanket while listening to the rain. Oddly, the situation should have felt awkward. Sharing a tent with someone I'd known for less than a day. Instead, it mostly felt practical. The storm had made the decision for us. Dean stretched out on his sleeping bag. "You snore." I laughed. "Not that anyone's complained." "Good." "You?" "Nope." "Perfect." Silence settled again. This time, it wasn't the distant silence we'd shared across the campsite. We were only a few feet apart, listening to the same rain, the same wind, the same occasional thunder. After several minutes, Dean spoke quietly. "I almost canceled this trip." I turned my head. "Really?" "3 different times." "Why?" He stared at the ceiling. "My brother convinced me to come." "You have a brother?" "Older." "You close?" "Yeah." "He said I needed to stop working." I smiled. "Sounds familiar." "What about you?" "My sister." "You have one too?" "Younger." "Close?" "Very." Dean nodded. "She probably told you to take a vacation." Almost word for word. He smiled. "Siblings know us too well." "They really do." The conversation drifted naturally after that. Family, travel, favorite national parks, the worst camping disasters we'd ever experienced. Mine involved raccoons. His involved a moose. The moose story was significantly better. "It stole your breakfast?" "My entire cooler." "I don't believe you." "I have pictures." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my flashlight. "You photographed the moose?" "I photograph everything." "I'd love to see that." "I'll show you tomorrow." "Tomorrow." Funny. Less than 24 hours ago, I'd hoped I wouldn't have to exchange more than 5 words with him. Now we were making plans for the next day. Eventually, the conversation faded. Rain softened outside. The storm finally seemed to be moving deeper into the mountains. Dean yawned. "I think we're safe." "I hope so. If another tree falls, I'm blaming the campground." "Deal." He reached over and switched off the lantern. Darkness filled the tent. Only soft rain remained. A few quiet minutes passed. Then, "Ryan." "Yeah." "I'm glad it was you." I blinked in the darkness. "What?" He sounded almost embarrassed. "I mean," he laughed quietly, "if I had to accidentally share a campsite with someone." He paused. "I'm glad it wasn't an asshole." I smiled to myself. "You got lucky." "So did you." "Yeah." For reasons I couldn't explain, that simple exchange stayed with me. Maybe because it was honest. Maybe because I'd expected this trip to be lonely. Instead, a reservation mistake had turned a complete stranger into the last person I'd spoken to before falling asleep. And somehow, that no longer felt strange at all. The first thing I heard the next morning was birds. Not rain, not thunder, just birds. For a few peaceful seconds, I forgot everything that had happened. Then I opened my eyes. Dean was already awake. He sat just outside the tent entrance with a steaming mug in his hands, watching the lake like he'd been there for hours. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees, turning the water gold. It looked like the storm had never happened. I crawled out of my sleeping bag. "Morning." Without looking back, he lifted another mug. "I made coffee." I laughed. "Again." "I told you." He took a sip. "I have priorities." I accepted the mug and stepped outside. The air smelled incredible. Fresh pine, wet earth, rain-soaked moss. Everything sparkled. Until I looked toward my campsite. Well, my tent looked defeated. One side had completely collapsed, and a broken pole poked through the fabric. Dean followed my gaze. "Yeah. I think it's dead." "I think you're right." We stood there quietly, drinking coffee. Eventually, I sighed. "I guess today's project is buying a new tent." Dean shook his head. "Nearest outdoor store is almost 2 hours away." "Seriously?" "Pretty much." I groaned. "So either I waste the entire day driving, or—" He glanced toward his own tent. "You keep staying here." I looked at him. "You sure?" He shrugged. "It already survived 1 night with you. I don't want to invade your space." "You aren't." There wasn't even a second of hesitation in his voice. Surprised me. Besides, he added, it's nice having someone to drink coffee with. That simple sentence landed somewhere unexpectedly warm. I smiled. I can contribute breakfast. Now we're negotiating. I make excellent pancakes. His eyebrows lifted. Camping pancakes? Trust me. I guess I'm about to find out. Half an hour later, we had turned the picnic table into a shared kitchen. Dean handled coffee. I handled breakfast. You cook? He asked while watching me mix batter. I had to learn. Why? My sister nearly cried the first time she saw my college diet. He laughed. How bad was it? I once ate instant noodles for 6 straight days. Ryan. I know. You deserved the intervention. I really did. He smiled while slicing fruit. I learned from my grandmother. Cooking. Everything. He paused. Photography came later. You've mentioned your brother. And now your grandmother. What about your parents? His smile softened. They're good. Just good. They live overseas most of the year. Oh, so my brother and I mostly grew up together. I nodded. My parents still live 20 minutes from me. Lucky. I never appreciated it until recently. Dean looked thoughtful. It's funny. What? I spend my life traveling. And the older I get. He looked out across the lake. The more home matters. Something about that felt incredibly honest. Not dramatic, just true. After breakfast, we cleaned everything together almost automatically. Neither of us commented on it. It simply happened. So, Dean stretched. I was planning to hike around the lake. I nodded. I brought my camera. He grinned. I noticed. You noticed. It weighs half as much as your backpack. I like photography. His eyes lit up. Seriously. A hobby. Still counts. I mostly shoot landscapes. He smiled. Now I definitely have to show you something. He disappeared into his tent and came back carrying a professional camera with an enormous lens. Wow. You know cameras? A little. He handed it to me carefully. Felt surprisingly heavy. This thing costs more than my car. He laughed. Not quite. I don't even want to ask. I've had it for years. I carefully handed it back. I suddenly understand why you were so calm during the storm. What do you mean? You saved the camera before anything else. I definitely did. No shame. None. I laughed. Fair enough. The hiking trail circled the lake through dense forest. Neither of us rushed. Dean stopped every few minutes. Sometimes for birds. Sometimes for flowers. Sometimes because sunlight hit the trees in an interesting way. I watched him crouch beside a fallen log. What is it? He pointed without speaking. At first I saw nothing. Then, a tiny fox peeked out from beneath the roots. No way. Dean slowly lifted his camera. Click, click, click. The fox watched us for several seconds before disappearing into the woods. He lowered the camera with a quiet smile. Worth carrying the extra weight. I get it now. What? Why you love this? He looked around. You spend enough time out here. He smiled softly. You realize nature doesn't perform. It just exists. And somehow. He shrugged. That's relaxing. I understood exactly what he meant. We continued walking. Conversation came and went naturally. Comfortable silences no longer needed explaining. Around noon, we reached a wooden dock extending over the lake. Dean sat on the edge. I joined him. Neither of us spoke. The water barely moved. A fish jumped somewhere in the distance. You know. I skipped a small stone across the surface. I almost canceled too. He looked over. This trip. Oh. I kept thinking I'd just stay home. What changed? I realized. I smiled awkwardly. If I stayed home, I'd probably spend my vacation answering work emails. Dean laughed. You absolutely would. I know. He leaned back on his hands. So, any regrets? I looked around. The mountains, the lake, the fresh air. Then at the stranger who didn't really feel like a stranger anymore. Not anymore. He smiled. Me neither. For a few seconds, neither of us looked away. Then both of us glanced toward the lake at exactly the same time. Almost as if we'd noticed the moment lasting a little too long. Neither of us mentioned it. Instead, Dean stood. Come on. Where? I know a better viewpoint. You've been here before? 3 years ago. And I've been hoping to come back ever since. As we started walking again, I realized something that caught me completely off guard. Yesterday morning, I had hoped we'd avoid each other. Now, I was actually looking forward to seeing where he wanted to take me next. Dean's better viewpoint turned out to be a place most people would have walked right past. The trail narrowed until it almost disappeared between the trees. We're still allowed here? I asked. He smiled. Technically, that doesn't sound reassuring. It's an unofficial trail. So, not exactly illegal? Let's call it locally approved. I laughed. I've known you for barely 2 days, and somehow this doesn't surprise me. Good. He stepped over a fallen tree. You're learning. 5 minutes later, the forest suddenly opened. I stopped walking. Wow. The lake stretched beneath us from a rocky overlook almost 50 feet above the shoreline. From here, the campground looked tiny. The mountains reflected perfectly in the water. No roads, no buildings, just endless forest. Dean leaned against a weathered pine tree. Worth the hike. I couldn't stop looking at the view. Absolutely. I found this place 3 years ago. I would have come back too. He nodded. Most people never see it. We stayed there for a long time, not talking, just listening to the wind moving through the trees. Eventually, Dean lifted his camera. You mind? I'd like to take a picture. Of the view. He hesitated. Partly. I looked at him. You fit the scene. I laughed. I've never heard anyone say that before. I'm serious. I'll probably ruin the composition. You won't. There wasn't anything strange about it. He wasn't asking me to pose. I simply stood where I already was, looking over the lake while he quietly took a few photographs. Click, click, click. He lowered the camera. Done. Can I see? He walked over beside me and turned the screen around. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. I wasn't looking at the camera. I was smiling at the lake without realizing it. The mountains filled the background. Sunlight caught the edge of my jacket. That's actually really good. Dean looked almost embarrassed. You make it easy. I glanced at him. No. I smiled. I think you're just talented. He rubbed the back of his neck. Thanks. There was something unexpectedly shy about the way he accepted compliments. I hadn't noticed it before. On the way back down the trail, conversation drifted toward easier topics. So, Dean asked, what's your worst job? I didn't even have to think. Tech support. He laughed immediately. That bad. A customer once insisted the internet was broken because his coffee machine stopped working. You're joking. I wish. What was actually wrong? He unplugged the router to charge his phone. Dean burst out laughing. I don't believe people like that exist. They absolutely do. He shook his head. Okay. My turn. Worst photography assignment? He sighed dramatically. A luxury resort. That sounds terrible already. They wanted authentic wilderness photos. So, they kept asking me to move wild animals closer to the cabins. I stared at him. What? Can you ask the deer to stand over there? I nearly doubled over laughing. No. I wish I were making that up. You told them no? I asked if they'd like me to negotiate with the bears too. That only made me laugh harder. By the time we reached the lake again, both of us were still smiling. The afternoon passed surprisingly quickly. Dean spent an hour photographing birds near the shoreline. I sat nearby reading, or at least pretending to read. Every now and then I'd glance up. Watching someone work when they genuinely loved what they were doing was strangely fascinating. He became incredibly patient, completely focused, as if nothing else existed. At one point, he lay flat on the ground just to photograph a turtle. Comfortable? I called. Without looking up, he answered, Very. Liar. I regret nothing. I shook my head, laughing. You photographers are weird. We absolutely are. Later that evening, we finally used the fire pit together. Neither of us suggested taking turns anymore. It simply felt unnecessary. Dean added another log to the fire. I've been thinking. That sounds dangerous. It usually is. I smiled. Go on. I'm still feeling guilty. About what? The reservation. I frowned. You didn't do anything. I know. But if I hadn't booked this campsite, you would have had a peaceful vacation. So would have you. I poked at the fire with a stick. Maybe. He looked across the flames. You don't sound convinced. I thought about it for a moment, then admitted something I hadn't expected to say. I don't think I'd have talked to anyone all week. Dean nodded slowly. I probably wouldn't either. Silence settled again. The fire cracked softly. Somewhere across the lake, an owl called into the darkness. You know what's funny? I asked. What? Yesterday morning. I smiled. I was hoping you'd stay on your side of the campsite. He laughed. I noticed. You noticed. You looked disappointed when you saw me. I wasn't disappointed. You absolutely were. I was surprised. You sighed. I did not sigh. He pointed at me dramatically. You definitely sighed. I couldn't help laughing. Fine. I sighed. He grinned triumphantly. I knew it. What about you? I thought you looked like someone who'd report me for making too much noise. I've never reported anyone in my life. I know that now. The conversation faded naturally after that. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence anymore. It had become comfortable, almost familiar. The fire burned lower. Stars slowly appeared overhead. I looked up. I forgot there were this many. Dean followed my gaze. City lights hide everything. Yeah. He leaned back in his chair. I think that's why I keep coming out here. The stars. He smiled. No. The perspective. I looked at him. My problems always seem enormous until I spend a night under a sky like this. I understood exactly what he meant. I've missed this. So have I. We stayed by the fire much longer than either of us had planned, talking about childhood memories, favorite books, places we'd always wanted to visit. At some point, I realized something strange. It didn't feel like meeting someone new anymore. It felt like continuing a conversation we'd somehow started years ago. And that realization caught me completely off guard. When the fire had almost burned out, Dean stood and stretched. I should probably sleep. Probably. He smiled. Hopefully without another storm. I'm voting for that. He took a few steps toward the tent before stopping, then turned back. Ryan. Yeah. His expression softened into a small, genuine smile. I'm really glad the reservation system messed up. For a moment, I forgot how to answer. Then I smiled back. Yeah. So am I. Neither of us realized it yet. But somewhere over the last 2 days, this had quietly stopped feeling like an inconvenience and started feeling like the best accident either of us had experienced in a very long time. The next morning was the first one that felt completely normal. Not because anything about the situation was normal, but because somewhere along the way we'd stopped acting like strangers. I woke to the smell of coffee. Again, I laughed before I even opened my eyes. You know, I said from inside the tent, you're becoming predictable. Dean's voice came from outside. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't. It absolutely was. I unzipped the tent. He was sitting on the same fallen log as yesterday, one mug already in his hands and another waiting beside him. You made enough for both of us. I've learned. Learned what? That you become much friendlier after caffeine. I accepted the mug. That's probably true. I know it is. We sat quietly watching the lake. The surface was perfectly still again. It was hard to believe a storm had nearly destroyed the campsite less than 2 days earlier. Dean glanced toward the remains of my tent. So, you really don't want to drive into town? I sighed. Not today. Good. I looked over. Good. He shrugged casually, but there was something almost hopeful in his expression. I was thinking we could rent a canoe. I blinked. They rent canoes here? At the dock. I didn't even notice. You were busy fighting your tent. Fair point. He smiled. So? I looked out across the lake. It was impossible to say no. I'm in. An hour later, we were pushing a bright green canoe into the water. The older man at the rental dock had looked at us with a grin. Beautiful day for it. Dean nodded. Finally. The man laughed. You boys earned this weather. Apparently everyone in the campground had survived the storm together. I climbed carefully into the front of the canoe. Dean settled into the back. You've done this before? I asked. A few hundred times. Seriously. Occupational hazard. Good. I picked up the paddle. Because I haven't. I guessed. You guessed. You almost sat in backwards. I did not. You absolutely did. I rolled my eyes. You're never letting anything go, are you? Probably not. Once we were away from shore, the campground disappeared behind the trees. Only water surrounded us. The canoe drifted effortlessly. I dipped the paddle into the lake. So, Dean looked relaxed for the first time since we'd met. What were you like as a kid? I laughed. That's random. I know. I thought for a second. Quiet. Still are. I talked more with books than people. He smiled. I can see that. What about you? He laughed to himself. The exact opposite. I don't believe that. I was. You. I climbed everything. Trees. Trees. Roofs. My parents weren't thrilled. I shook my head. You definitely sound like trouble. I absolutely was. The canoe drifted beneath overhanging branches. Sunlight danced across the water. Dean slowed his paddling. There. I followed his gaze. A bald eagle circled high above the lake. Without another word, he reached for his camera. Even in a canoe, his movements were practiced and steady. Click, click, click. He lowered it with a satisfied smile. Got it. You always carry that thing. I'd regret it if I didn't. I get that now. We stopped near a tiny island in the middle of the lake. Not much more than a cluster of rocks and pine trees. Dean tied the canoe loosely to a branch. No camping allowed, he said. But we're allowed to stretch our legs. The island couldn't have taken more than 5 minutes to walk across. Still, it felt like discovering somewhere secret. We found a smooth rock overlooking the water. I sat down. Dean joined me a moment later. Neither of us rushed to leave. This is nice, I said quietly. It is. I don't think I've relaxed this much in years. He looked toward the distant mountains. I was hoping you'd say that. I turned toward him. You were. He nodded. When we first met. He laughed. You looked exhausted. I was. No. He looked at me for a moment. You looked tired. There was a difference. I knew exactly what he meant. I guess I was. He nodded slowly. I've been there. We fell silent again. The breeze moved gently through the trees. A fish disturbed the otherwise perfect reflection below us. After a while, Dean spoke again. Can I tell you something? Sure. I almost didn't become a photographer. That surprised me. What were you going to do? My dad wanted me to study business. And I tried. He smiled faintly. For almost a year. What happened? I realized I dreaded every morning. I understood that feeling. So you quit. I did. Were they angry? For a while. And now? They tell everyone I'm a photographer. I smiled. They came around. Eventually. He skipped a pebble across the lake. What about you? What about me? If money didn't matter. He looked genuinely curious. What would you do? The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I honestly didn't know. Dean noticed. You've never thought about it. No. He nodded gently. Maybe that's something worth figuring out. For some reason, that simple sentence stayed with me. Not because he was trying to give advice. He wasn't. He was simply curious. And somehow, I realized I'd spent years planning promotions, deadlines, and projects without ever asking myself what actually made me happy. The realization was uncomfortable, but not because of Dean, because he was right, completely right. We sat there until neither of us felt like talking anymore. Eventually, Dean stood and offered me a hand. "Come on." "Where now?" He smiled. "I know another place." I laughed. "Of course you do. Trust me." "I probably shouldn't." "You definitely should." I took his hand only long enough to stand, and he let go immediately. The gesture was casual, natural. Neither of us thought twice about it. Then we climbed back into the canoe. Neither of us noticed the older couple watching from another boat nearby. The woman smiled knowingly at us. Her husband leaned over and whispered something. She laughed. Dean and I were too busy arguing over whose paddling was worse to notice. On the way back to shore, neither of us mentioned the couple in the other canoe. Mostly because we hadn't noticed them. We were too busy trying to paddle in the same rhythm. "Ryan, I'm trying." "No." Dean laughed. "You're splashing me." "I'm absolutely not." "You absolutely are. I've never done this before." "I can tell." I deliberately dipped my paddle a little deeper. Water sprayed directly toward him. He stared at me. "Really?" I grinned. "That one was intentional." "So we're doing this now?" "I guess we are." He shook his head. "Oh, you're making a mistake." 5 seconds later, his paddle sent an even bigger wave in my direction. "Dean!" He laughed so hard the canoe drifted sideways. "I warned you." "You started it." "I definitely didn't." For the next few minutes, we behaved like two 12-year-olds. The canoe zigzagged across the lake while both of us insisted the other one was responsible. Eventually, we were laughing too hard to keep splashing each other. "I surrender," I said. "You should." "My shirt's soaked." "Justice." "I hate you." "No, you don't." The words slipped out naturally. Neither of us reacted. Because he was right. Back at the campsite, we pulled the canoe onto the dock. The older man who had rented it to us looked between us. "You boys have fun?" Dean nodded. "Definitely." The man smiled. "I figured." "How?" "You came back laughing." He shrugged. "That's usually a good sign." As we walked back toward the campsite, Dean nudged my shoulder lightly. "He's right." "About what?" "You laughed more today than yesterday." I thought about it. He wasn't wrong. "I guess I did." He smiled. "I like that." The comment was simple, completely casual. Still, I found myself smiling for the rest of the walk. That afternoon passed lazily. No hiking, no plans, just reading, coffee, and occasional conversation whenever one of us felt like speaking. At some point, I looked up from my book. Dean was sorting through photographs on his camera. "You ever delete any?" "Thousands." "Really?" "Oh yeah." He turned the screen toward me. "I might take 500 pictures. And keep. Maybe 20. I whistled softly. "That's brutal." He shrugged. "The bad ones help me find the good ones." I watched him scroll through images. Birds. Mountains. The fox from yesterday. Then, the photograph he'd taken of me at the overlook. I smiled. "You kept that one." He hesitated for the first time all day. "Yeah. I thought you said you only keep the good ones." He looked at the screen. "I do." Our eyes met for a brief second. Then both of us looked away. Neither of us said anything else. But the silence felt different. As evening settled over the campground, more campers gathered near the communal fire pit by the lake. Music drifted softly through the trees. Someone was roasting marshmallows. Children chased each other between the picnic tables. Dean looked toward the lights. "You want to go?" I followed his gaze. "I thought you came here to avoid people." "I did." "So did I." He smiled. "But maybe one evening won't hurt." I considered it. Honestly, a week ago I would have said no without thinking. Now, sure. The gathering was small. Maybe 15 people. Mostly couples and families. The atmosphere felt relaxed. Nobody paid much attention to us. We found 2 empty chairs near the fire. An older woman offered us roasted corn. Dean accepted immediately. I laughed. You trust strangers too easily. She overheard me. Honey, she smiled warmly. I've been camping here for 20 years. Dean looked at me triumphantly. See, I stand corrected. The woman glanced between us. How long have you boys been together? I blinked. Dean nearly dropped the corn. Oh, the woman looked confused. I'm sorry. We're actually… Dean searched for the right word. We only met 2 days ago. Her eyebrows shot upward. You're kidding. I shook my head. There was a reservation mistake. She laughed. Oh, that's even better. Her husband looked over from the fire. That's how we met. Dean frowned. What? The older man smiled. Wrong hotel room. His wife rolled her eyes affectionately. I walked into the room. He insisted it was his. It wasn't. It definitely wasn't. Everyone nearby laughed. The woman looked back at us. Sometimes accidents work out. Dean smiled politely. Sometimes. She winked. Enjoy your vacation. Neither of us knew how to answer that. Later, walking back through the trees, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Dean laughed quietly. Wrong hotel room? I smiled. I liked that story. So did I. Another few steps passed. Then he said, She thought we were together. She did. You weren't uncomfortable? I looked at him honestly. No. He was quiet. Me neither. The answer hung gently between us. Neither of us rushed to explain it. Neither of us needed to. The campsite came into view again. Our shared tent stood beneath the tall pines. My broken tent still waited beside it, reminding me why all of this had started. One reservation, one storm, one unexpected friendship. I looked over at Dean as we reached the fire pit. He was already looking at me. For a second, neither of us looked away. There was no awkwardness anymore. Just something neither of us had found the words for yet. And somehow, I had a feeling the hardest part of this trip wasn't going to be leaving the campground. It was going to be figuring out what happened after we did. Neither of us said much that night. Not because there was nothing left to talk about, because suddenly it felt like every conversation mattered. The trip was almost over. Tomorrow we'd pack our cars, drive in opposite directions, return to lives that had existed before a reservation system decided to make a mistake. For the first time since arriving, that thought bothered me. The next morning was unusually quiet. No jokes, no teasing over coffee, just the familiar sounds of birds and the lake. Dean sat on the log with his mug, watching the sunrise. I joined him. Last morning. He nodded. Yeah. Neither of us looked at each other. I'm not ready, I admitted. He smiled faintly. I know. After another minute he stood. I'll make breakfast. I'll help. You always help. I know. Felt strangely domestic. One of us making pancakes, the other cutting fruit, passing plates without asking, refilling coffee before the other person noticed the mug was empty. It was ridiculous. We'd only known each other for 5 days. It shouldn't have felt this natural. Packing took less than an hour. My broken tent was beyond saving. Dean helped fold what remained anyway. You can throw it away when we reach town. I know. He tied the damaged poles together. Sorry. I looked up. For what? If the storm hadn't happened. I interrupted him with a smile. If the storm hadn't happened. I looked around the campsite. We probably would have spent the entire week pretending the other didn't exist. He laughed quietly. You're probably right. No. I corrected myself. I'm definitely right. By noon both vehicles were loaded. The campsite looked empty again, as if neither of us had ever been there. Funny how quickly places erase your presence. Dean rested one hand on the roof of his SUV. So, this is usually the awkward part. It is. Neither of us moved. Neither of us seemed interested in saying goodbye. Dean finally broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Sure. If we'd been assigned different campsites. He smiled. Do you think we would have ever talked? I considered it honestly. Maybe once. To complain about mosquitoes. Probably. He laughed. And then we'd have gone home. Without learning each other's names. Exactly. The thought felt strangely sad. Dean reached into his backpack. I almost forgot. He pulled out a small envelope. What's that? The photos. You printed them? I found a little photo printer in town yesterday. I stared at him. You drove into town? Early yesterday morning. While I was asleep? He nodded. I needed fuel. Then he smiled. And I wanted to print something. Inside the envelope were several photographs. The fox, the eagle, the lake at sunrise, the canoe, the mountains, and finally, the picture of me standing at the overlook. I looked at it for a long moment. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to. I've never liked pictures of myself. What about that one? I smiled. I do. Good. Thank you. I reached into my own backpack. I've got something too. Dean looked surprised. You do. I handed him the novel I'd been carrying all week. Inside the front cover I'd written a short note. For the guy who accidentally became the best part of this trip. Next time, let's plan it instead of letting the reservation system do it. He read it twice, then looked up. Ryan, I know it's not much. He closed the book carefully. It's perfect. Another silence. Longer this time. Neither of us wanted to be the one who ended it. Finally, Dean laughed softly. This feels ridiculous. What does? We've known each other less than a week. I know. And somehow. He searched for the words. It doesn't feel like it. No, it really doesn't. He looked down for a second, then back at me. I don't really believe in coincidences. You don't. No. But. He smiled. I'm glad this one happened. I took a slow breath. So am I. He hesitated. Ryan. Yeah. When you said. He rubbed the back of his neck. That you didn't know what you'd do if money didn't matter. I remember. Have you thought about it? I nodded. Since we talked. And. I smiled. I think I'd travel more. His eyes lit up. Really? Yeah. I forgot how much I enjoy seeing new places. He laughed. I might know a photographer who could recommend a few. I was hoping you'd say that. He reached into his pocket. Give me your phone. I handed it over. He entered his number, then handed it back. There. So this isn't goodbye? He looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. I never intended it to be. I smiled. Good. Good. I was trying to figure out how to ask without sounding weird. Dean laughed. You would have failed. I probably would have. We hugged. Briefly. Naturally. The kind of hug shared between two people who both understood that something important had happened, even if neither of them fully knew what it meant yet. When we stepped back, Dean smiled. So, next trip. I nodded. Next trip. No reservation mistakes this time. Definitely not. He grinned. Although. What? They worked out pretty well. I laughed. They really did. I watched his SUV disappear down the gravel road. For a few moments I just stood there, listening. The campground was quiet again. Exactly the kind of silence I'd come looking for. Only now, it didn't feel nearly as appealing. 3 weeks later, my phone buzzed while I was sitting at work. Dean. Found another campground. A second message arrived almost immediately. This time I booked 2 different campsites. I laughed. Then the third message appeared. Just kidding. A fourth followed. 1 campsite. On purpose. I stared at the screen, smiling like an idiot in the middle of the office. For the first time in years, the thought of another trip didn't feel like running away from my life. It felt like running towards something. I typed my reply. Send me the dates. His answer came less than 10 seconds later. Already did. Maybe some stories begin because 2 people make the right decision. Ours began because a computer made the wrong one. And neither of us ever wanted that mistake corrected.